Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of George Mason University and Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, find other episodes, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is September 1st, 2010, and my guest is Arnold Kling. Arnold blogs at EconLog, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. His latest book is Unchecked and Unbalanced, How the Discrepancy Between Knowledge and Power Caused the Financial Crisis and Threatens Democracy. Arnold, welcome back to EconTalk.
Oh, good to be here, Russ.
What is the discrepancy between knowledge and power that is the focus of your book?
The idea is that knowledge has become increasingly specialized and dispersed, but power is becoming increasingly concentrated. That's the discrepancy.
And why is that important?
Well, as we've, I'm sure, discussed many times on this program, the markets allow for dispersed knowledge to be aggregated. This is Hayek's story, so that information flows into prices and markets work that way. So that if knowledge is becoming increasingly dispersed, that would suggest that you would want to have more social transactions mediated by markets. And yet we have this oddity that political power is becoming more concentrated, and perhaps we're having more transactions mediated by central planning. And if that's true, then that discrepancy should be causing inefficiency and just general dissatisfaction.
Well, let's start by talking about the dispersion of knowledge. It's a really fascinating part of the book, and your observations on specialization. So you confess this isn't an easy thing to measure, obviously. There's no Gini coefficient for knowledge or any respectable simple measure, but there's a lot of suggestions that in the world around us that knowledge has gotten more specialized, and that our tasks have gotten more specialized. Give us some of that information.
Yeah, we have some indicators. It's too bad that, something like a Gini coefficient for knowledge, you'd think you could almost develop that if you really decided that that's what you wanted to do. And if some researcher wants to do that in some field, like library science or something, that would be a kind of a cool thing to do. But there are a number of indications. You can track the number of medical specialties, and that's clearly gone up. I think you can track legal specialties. If you go to a college campus, you will see many more possible majors than you did 30 years ago. You can see that product diversity has gotten higher, and there are people who argue that that's a big welfare increase. That they're just the fact that there are more different products out there.
Some say it's a decrease. They think we can't make these choices.
The Barry Schwartz argument.
Yeah,
yes.
It's not my favorite, but yeah, there's a lot more specialization within product design. Clearly.
Yeah. And there are a lot of occupations that just didn't exist years ago. I mean, my favorite example, a friend of mine's, two college graduate daughters have, one has a job as a web designer for a large financial firm, and another one is works with a company that does social media marketing, whatever that is. Well, those jobs didn't exist 20 years when these kids were born.
Right.
And so there's just been the proliferation of new occupations that, and I think you could also document that.
You also point out, which I like, how much harder it is to be a Renaissance person, right? That it was imaginable 400 years ago that you could read you could master a relatively large part of the world's knowledge 400 or 500 years ago.
Yeah, I think people thought, that I've seen it argued that someone like, Leibniz basically knew just about everything that could be known at that time. And you could have someone like Da Vinci, who was, just a superior in many fields. Now you're considered a Renaissance person if you are good in a couple of things.
You know something about lots of things rather than mastering.
Yeah, or you can master a couple things, or you can know something about a lot, but the notion that the same person could be a master in many fields is just, it's almost unthinkable now.
Of course, you could argue that that's simply a change in the returns to mastery, right? The cost of mastering lots of things has probably gone up, and maybe that's proof of your point. Certainly the return to specialization has gone up, right? Yeah. And I think within every subfield, it would be true as well. As you point out, medicine and law be an example. Mathematics, the Leibniz of today, whoever that is, the smartest. I'm thinking of Abirad. He's the smartest man in the world. How much of modern mathematics, modern physics, could a Newton or Leibniz alive today master? And the answer is not all of it. Not even within their quote narrow discipline of math or physics.
Yeah, I would think even compared to when we went to graduate school in economics and going to graduate school today, the amount of economics that you would not cover as a graduate student would be a lot higher today. I mean, there's just so much more that you would have. If you wanted to try to be the complete economist, and today you'd think of all the finance, which was around when we were there, but behavioral economics was not. Experimental economics was not.
Or it was less prominent.
And these what they call macroeconomics now. I used to call myself a macroeconomist. I can't follow contemporary macroeconomics. I mean, I sort of can, but it's these Euler this highly mathematical Euler equation stuff.
Yeah, although I'm not, some of that it's interesting. I think there's probably a difference between being a pediatric kidney specialist and being a some kind of flavor of macroeconomist in terms of the social value of what the mastery involves of that narrow subdiscipline. There's certainly a profusion of journals in every discipline. So if you really want to call yourself a master of, say, the literature within any field, I'm just not sure that leads to any true mastery in some areas, but economics, for example. But let's take your point as true, that there's been two phenomena: an explosion of knowledge and a specialization within that wider span of knowledge, so that it's really a combination of the returns and the underlying landscape, right? Yeah. The returns to mastery of a narrow subdiscipline have gone up, and there's just more to learn. So the idea that it's clearly true that knowledge, I accept your point, I think most people would, that knowledge is more dispersed.
And let's emphasize, this isn't just an issue for people who are trying to become academics. It's true for somebody in business. If you want to be a CEO, there are many more things that you have to understand than you used to. I mean, you didn't used to have to understand information technology to be a CEO. You didn't have to be an expert in global supply chain management. You didn't necessarily have to understand logistics. You didn't have to be as sophisticated in finance. And I would even say that for consumers, the amount of knowledge you need is much more. There's a lot more different financial instruments available for you to either trip up on or take advantage of. There's all sorts of different products and services that didn't exist. So it affects every form of behavior.
So let's stick with the economy for a minute, and then we'll turn to the government side. So the economy, faced with this reality, which it's creating, of course, in an emergent Hayekian way, responds by, as you point out in the book, outsourcing, and not just overseas outsourcing, but what we would call less vertical integration, right? More outsourcing of delegation of tasks outside the umbrella of the firm itself, hiring all kinds of specialists to do tasks, data processing, legal compliance, et cetera, right?
And for the consumer as well. Households are outsourcing more of the food preparation, more cleaning, lawn care, and they're engaging in much more complex forms of electronic communication. So now you have your cell phone. Do you still keep your landline? So life has become more complex for everybody in this environment.
Right. Although, again, it's kind of a weird thing. I have a computer network in my house so that I can access the internet wirelessly. That's a bizarre thing. Right, I'm running an IT center, and I do that. See, that's why there's a measurement question here. Has my household gotten more specialized or less specialized? What the heck am I doing with an IT network in my house? Why wouldn't I get that provided some other way? And of course, I sort of do. Verizon supplies it. I don't really master much of it, other than opening the door for a person that I presume works for Verizon and letting them drill in the wall of my house to do the wiring, etc. So the phenomenon, and of course I understand very little of it. I'm good at turning it on and off. But it's a little hard to measure, again, these phenomena.
And just one other comment on that is that it really makes us very much dependent on other people's expertise.
Yep.
So, when something goes down on your network, you have to call a service person, maybe somebody in India or whatever, and you're really grateful when the person at the other end can actually solve your problem.
Yeah, boy.
And we're relying on all sorts of expertise, sort of almost implicitly. Like when you buy the computer, you sort of trust that the computer will be compatible with your network. And that's kind of trusting the expertise of the people manufacturing and selling your computer. So it's just incredible the amount of expertise that we rely on in this specialized world.
And I just want to mention, scheduled for next week is a podcast with Alain de Botton on this phenomenon, just the psychological impact of the fact that our job descriptions are much narrower than they used to be, and what we spend our days doing, by definition, is typically much more specialized than it was a long time ago, even perhaps very recently.
And just to pick up on a little bit, you had Dan Pink on, and he's talking about people needing to feel this sense of mastery and so on, and
as a source of satisfaction
and autonomy and these other things. And one possibility I raised is that for a lot of people, they're going to have to get some of that satisfaction in their hobbies rather than in their job. Their job, they may have to specialize in something that maybe they didn't particularly want to enjoy and devote their life to, and they might have to end up.
Well, I see it more as a personality issue. I think there are a lot of people who love doing one thing and mastering it. The guy who comes to my house and sets up my wireless connection. Now, there's some challenges probably in certain situations, but pretty much that's what you're doing all day long. If you think about it, you get the satisfaction. You're helping somebody get access to the internet. It makes you feel good. But the moment-to-moment challenges of the job are not that exhilarating, I assume. I could be wrong.
Yeah.
I think it's very important in all these stories that you don't presume that someone's like you. That's not my favorite job. Maybe it is someone else's favorite. But it does seem to me that for some people that's probably very, very satisfying. To go into a job with a person under some stress, the homeowner who's worried that this isn't going to work, and you do it well, and you see a beaming face at the end of that experience because they're so appreciative of what you did. You solve people's problems that way. Maybe that's very satisfying. But it could be just that some people don't have a personality where they enjoy doing something similar. They really have to, quote, break it up. So I'm not sure it's in the nature of the types of specialization we have. It could just be more there's some people who want variety very badly in their minute-to-minute, moment-to-moment, hour-to-hour workspace. So it's an interesting question. But anyway, let's turn to government now. So while knowledge in the in the economy is getting incredibly dispersed, much more specialization, and as a result, power, you could argue, and we're going to come back to this, power in the marketplace is therefore being dispersed because knowledge is dispersed. Power in the government is not tends in recent years to be some more centralized. What's going on there?
Well, there's several things. One of the things is that the number of government units stays fixed. We have one Congress, we have 50 states, and so on. Meanwhile, the population within these units increases, so that increases the scale. And another thing is that the amount of money, just to use money as a measure, per government unit is going up. That is, each state is spending more per constituent, and the federal government is spending more per constituent. So if you take the dollars per constituent going up and you multiply that by constituents per legislator or constituents per government unit going up, you get an explosion in the overall scale of government. In addition, you get, so I call that scale creep. In addition, you get what I call scope creep, that is government seeming to become involved in things that, at least in the United States, it didn't used to be involved in. It didn't used to be what didn't used to be an environmental protection function. It didn't used to be as involved in providing health insurance, and it seems to be getting more involved. And at the federal level, it wasn't very much involved in education, but it's becoming increasingly involved. So both the scope and the scale of government have been increasing.
Wouldn't one of the relevant measures, though, be the size of government employment? It's true that, as you point out in the book, that dollars allocated per legislator, that is, the scope of senators or Congress representatives to spend money, has certainly grown because government's gotten bigger. And as you point out, there's only 435 members of Congress. That hasn't grown. There's only 100 senators. That hasn't changed. You could argue it should get smaller, though. It's not. It could be they're more efficient at allocating. It could be, and therefore it starts you to think about the employees who disperse the money, not just the ones who affect the allocation of the money. Size of government at the federal level hasn't grown that. I don't think has grown very much. State and local have grown tremendously, right? So you could argue that there's always this weird tension that you'd think that state and local government would be, it'd be good that they grow because they're closer to the constituents. It's not obvious that they are. It's not obvious that state and locals run more efficiently. If anything, I think it's probably run less efficiently. It seems to me people pay less attention. There's less oversight, less monitoring. I'm babbling. Go ahead, Arnold. Why don't you react?
I think that when I first started to write this book, I was going to use as kind of my hook, my basic example, the county where we live, Montgomery County, where we have 9 county councils.
It's in Maryland.
In Maryland. Yeah, there are Montgomery counties and other places, but the one in Maryland. There are 9 county council members allocating a budget of $4.5 billion. Now, there are very few people in this world who could, if you divide that 4.5 by 5, that's $900 million. There are very few.
By 9. It's 5.
By 9, you get $500 million. So there are very few people who could spend $500 million apiece every year consistently, that have that kind of power. So it's just, and nobody's heard of these people. They're not, they're never going to be president of the U.S.
They're not even household names in Montgomery County. I don't know who they are.
Yeah.
And I live there as you do.
Yeah, I could maybe name 2 of them or 3. And, so that was my example. There's an incredible amount of power, and there's very little checks and balances. Actually, I think basically, the county's sort of run by the teachers union. I mean, I think there are a lot of localities that are run by public employees unions, and certainly, that's my impression of the politics of the county. So the teachers union follows it. Pretty much nobody else follows it closely enough or has a big enough impact. I have to
interrupt. I always find it fascinating, and I may have mentioned this recently on the program. I always find it fascinating that people running for office in my area will have yard signs sprinkled around the neighborhood with a little apple on it that says teacher recommended, as if that's a selling point. to me, it means they're in the pocket of special interests. How about parent recommended, student recommended? But why is teacher? It's supposed to make me think, oh, they're good for education. It tells me they're good for teachers. It's not the same thing. Why is that so hard for people to understand?
And they're not even necessarily good for teachers. They're good for sort of fattening up the administration within the
that's true. Yeah,
within the schools. But I want an apple with a line through it as a symbol for my candidate. But anyway, but that seemed to me an incredible amount of power.
As you point out in the book, they're all one party.
Yeah, they're all one party, and it's so there are very little checks and balances at work, dealing with those people. And I think that was going to be my big example. So back to your issue of state and local government, there is that problem that they are not that the checks and balances can often work poorly, and the governmental units are just not what they used to be. You can't call this local government. There are close to 1 million people in the county trying to elect these 9 representatives. So that's in part why a special interest group has so much power, because they don't know, these 9 people don't know or care about their constituents as individuals. They only care about these a really large aggregate. This Montgomery County is about the size of one of the largest cantons in Switzerland. So if Montgomery County were in Switzerland, the legislature would have probably 150 people in it, and it would be a canton. That is, there would be a governmental layer underneath that would be the local government. So Montgomery County would not be the local government in Switzerland. Montgomery County would be sort of like a state.
Right.
And it would have a legislature size of about 120 to 150 people.
So you're suggesting that we need a larger government measured by legislators or representatives to disperse their power somewhat, potentially, as a way to solve this problem.
But that's one direction to go.
Or smaller or less spending would also do it.
Yeah,
would go that way.
But one direction to go, if you wanted to, from just a purely democratic point of view, reconstruct the world of, let's say, 1800, you would have to divide this country into about 250 equal-sized states, and then each state would have to be divided then into these much smaller units. Or if you wanted this country to look like Switzerland, which is, I think, maybe the last example of a truly federalist country in the world, you would have to take a state like Maryland, divide it up have each county be sort of like a state with a legislature of 100 or more people, and then each county would have to further subdivide into smaller government units.
Sounds terribly inefficient, though. Okay,
so could be that scale in government is not a bug as I'm describing it. It's a feature. Now, I think from the standpoint of view of democratic equality, it's almost clearly a bug. If you have 9 people running a county of 1 million people, that's really an incredible concentration of power. So whether that's economically efficient or not, I think we can say that from a democratic point of view, it's hard to feel that you're equal to those 9 people, that you're on the same level, that they belong to you, that they're your neighbors or anything like that.
Or, as you point out, that you're equal to the people who influence them. And you picked the teachers union, which is one special interest group. The 2 that I've picked on in Montgomery County are the taxi cab business, which is there's a lot of donations that come from one taxi cab company, and they basically, I think they have a monopoly in the county. Yeah. It's a bizarre idea. Similarly, the county makes it extremely difficult for a large store to open. They have to have special permitting if you're a super Walmart. So there's no super Walmart, as far as I know, in Montgomery County. And the groceries is not very well provided.
And real estate development is, pretty much a graft thing, as best I understand it. Supposedly we have
cynical, Arnold.
Supposedly we have all these planning regulations that would make our county nice and pristine. It actually looks pretty ugly in many areas, and you assume that that's just because the developers understand which political party their bread is buttered on. So the But so potentially this scale, this high scale could be a feature. But let's take
it's sufficient.
Yeah, but let's take an example that's been studied, which is school districts. Economists have studied the optimal scale of a school district, and it's much smaller than Montgomery County. Yes, it's inefficient to have a school district with 150, 200 students in it, but you don't need 100,000 students to have an efficient scale. I think maybe the efficient scales maybe in the 10,000, 20,000 range. I'd have to check on that. But we have in this country consolidated school districts to the point where many, many school districts are much larger than that sort of point of maximum efficiency. And so all you get at that point is additional concentration of power with no gain in efficiency.
Yeah, there's obviously a trade-off there between responsiveness to the will of the electorate. Again, it's the same as we see this in economics all the time. What's the efficient size of a restaurant? Well, it's not one that serves 4,000 people. And so we see franchises that brand restaurants of smaller size, but all that emerges from the marketplace. It's pretty clear that the school system isn't emergent from anything other than the pursuit of power. It's not turning out so well. So let me challenge your viewpoint and raise an alternative view. So, in the face of all this specialization that's going on in the private sector, so we have two trends. We have this that you're pointing out seems to be a discrepancy of the specialization and the dispersion of knowledge in the private sector, and you have the concentration of power and influence in the government sector. A lot of people argue it's actually the opposite. It's true there's a dispersion of knowledge, but there's an increase and a centralization of power in the private sector, in the economic sector. So, for example, there's economies of scale in, say, search engines. There's economies of scale in the media world, and as a result, it's true there's a lot of specialization, but the units that are the umbrella for the specialization, Google or Disney. A lot of people worry. I'm not one of them, but a lot of people do worry that offsets this dispersion you're talking about, and there's actually a great deal of concentration of power. And as a result, as you do mention the possibility in the book, you've got to have this centralization of power on the government side to fight against this centralization of power on the economic side.
Okay, a couple things there. Let me just start with the last one. I don't think that there's much evidence that having a strong central government weakens concentration of economic power. I think we shouldn't make that assumption. I think it actually leads to the opposite. That ultimately powerful government and powerful large firms are friends. And the classic example is in the first section of the book, talking about the financial crisis, where Goldman Sachs, Freddie Mac, Fannie Mae, government will do anything but put them out of business or even allow them to go out of business. So even when they fail, they don't go out of business. So to say that big government is the enemy,
is a bulwark of
it defends the little people against them is kind of backwards.
Great point.
Going back to the economies of scale, there really are economies of scale that that utility companies can take advantage of, that communications companies can take advantage of, that maybe Google can take advantage of. There are some genuine economies of scale. And there's nothing wrong with economies of scale emerging and people taking advantage of them, and sometimes they go away or people find a way to overcome them, and so somebody who seems to be on top, like IBM, there seem to be fantastic scale economies in the computer industry 30 years ago, and we had to worry about breaking up IBM, and it turned out we didn't have to worry about breaking up IBM.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm not... I think that process emerges okay. I think that in the case of government, the scale economy of the production system is quite artificial. As government says, we're going to do this. We're going to have large school systems, and it's not, as you say, because the large school systems have competed away outcompeted small school system. It's just because we've just decided to do it. We will do it because we can.
Yeah. A similar example, which you've written about extensively at EconLog and is also in the book, is this whole idea that we need a systemic regulator, global regulator, which has a certain appeal, right? Someone's going to look out for everything and not just. We need more generalists in that dimension, and you're skeptical of that also. Yeah.
So in something like the financial system, it's I think a classic case where the expertise that you want to have to regulate the financial system just plain does not exist. So what happened, for example, when the subprime mortgage crisis hit, Bernanke and others thought that, well, it will be a very confined crisis. It will affect housing a little bit.
I thought that too. I was wrong.
Yeah, a lot of people, and it turned out that a lot of the people regulating the system didn't understand what I would call the embedded put options that companies were writing to a great extent. AIG being the classic example. So it turned out that the real expertise didn't exist. And I'd say even in September or October of 2008, as I was watching Bernanke and Paulson, I was wincing at some of the things they were saying because I understand enough of mortgage finance to know that they just had it completely wrong in their understanding of how these instruments worked.
Well, you're presuming that they were trying to understand it, and right, there's it's a bizarre situation. They're making public pronouncements that are supposed to calm markets or maybe disguise what they're actually doing, right?
No, but I don't know. I think they genuinely, in this case, did not understand the instruments they were dealing with. Because, they did. I don't think that Paulson was cynical when he said we were going to buy up the toxic assets. Fair enough. Only after they passed the bill, the TARP bill, that enough experts were able to kind of get it through his thick skull that these are not the types of assets that you can just buy up like bonds. Yeah. And so that was a real instance, a real demonstration of a lack of expertise on the part of the people who had the power. And
Shouldn't he have checked before? Wouldn't that have been an interesting strategy instead of being told after? Right. It's not. Going back to this idea of dispersion. It's not an indictment of Paulson or Bernanke that they didn't understand mortgage finance as well as you did, who worked at Freddie Mac. The indictment is, why didn't they draw on the knowledge of others in advance? And of course, the next question would be, why didn't they have to resign? Why were they not asked to resign, or why was their resignation not tendered for that failure? That's a separate issue.
Yeah, but so what you what you keep wanting in theory is this super regulator who will know who to ask the right people, obtain the right information,
have the good database.
Yeah, and it's just elusive. It's for the reason that Hayek, explained during the socialist calculation debate. You just cannot put all of the information into a central computer and outthink the dispersed knowledge and information that you get in the market. It's just not possible to do that. Okay, so I think it's very frustrating for people to think about that and very counterintuitive.
They prefer it not to be true.
Yeah. At the end of this month, I've been invited to participate in a conference on sort of the American labor force or something like that. And I get this sense, maybe I'll be wrong, but I'll be like, sort of feel like the token Negro at a Ku Klux Klan rally there, because I think my guess is everyone there is going to have what they think of as a solution that the government can implement
to make
centrally.
The labor market work better, yeah.
And I'm going to ask these people, well, what if you didn't have the government to back your solution? Could you raise money to be an entrepreneur and implement this solution? And they might say, well, I could, but the people I'm trying to help couldn't afford to pay for it. And then I'll push back, well, could you raise money for, could you convince me as a charitable donor to invest in your solution? But I think there's just this, the idea that a decentralized approach to solving a problem, a trial and error approach, is just very counterintuitive to people. They've got to believe that there's there's an intelligent designer out there who can solve it centrally.
An expert. Let me push back on that idea in a different way. There was a really fascinating article in the New Yorker a year or so ago by Atul Gawande, the physician, and he talks about a person. I think we talked about this actually in our podcast on healthcare. A person comes to a senior citizen, old person comes to the office with a bunch of problems, and she gets sent to a bunch of specialists, and they each talk about the thing to fix, her bad feet and her heart problem. She's got cancer, and so she goes to all the specialists, and they each prescribe a bunch of either drugs or therapies or other things. But there's a generalist she also sees who sees that these problems, some of these solutions are not going to work well with each other. They don't play well together. Yeah. And rather than looking for a nail with the hammer that his specialty is always using, he prescribes a more general set of solutions that are much better for her. And Gawande's point is we need more generalists, especially for old people. And I would argue that the current system, our healthcare system, destroys the incentives for that kind of market-based solution. And so therefore I can understand the appeal of mandating more generalists. Could you argue that the specialization we're talking about in the regulatory world or in the private sector, in the voluntary world, we need to subsidize generalists, people who take a look at a bigger picture. It's true they can't master all the details of say, the derivatives market, but don't we need people to oversee these complex systems? Because no individual has an incentive. It's a very common argument of the left. No individual has an incentive to care about the fragility of the whole, stability and fragility of the whole system. So isn't that what a potential role for regulators? It's a horrible argument, I know, Arnold, but it's one I hear a lot, and it's thought-provoking.
Again, the question, in theory, if you find this, almost omniscient generalist, let me know, because in theory, it certainly is a great idea. I think what in practice you get is that people whose view of themselves or the expectations that people place on them are unrealistically high, and it's usually a combination of both, because somebody who had a realistic understanding of their limitations probably would not find their way into a position where they're expected to do something that they don't think is possible. I mean, let me give you a trivial example. Estimating the multiplier from the fiscal stimulus. If somebody said, Arnold, go on CNN and tell them what the multiplier is for the fiscal stimulus, I would babble because
they often want to know.
I'd babble. I'd have no idea because it could be negative, it could be +4. I mean, I could give arguments all over the place. I don't believe it's an empirically demonstratable number. On the other hand, Mark Zandi comes on there. It says it's 1.5. Well, he's the one who gets on TV. And those are the types of people who make it into the positions of power. So what you end up with, if you believe in this omniscient regulator, you kind of get what you pay for. You get somebody who thinks that they know more than they really do. And, I think and who lives with that expectation. So someone like Paulson says, people expect me to have all this knowledge, to act as if I have all this knowledge. So by golly, and that's how I've gotten ahead, so I'm going to go ahead and do it. And then it turns out that he doesn't. Of course, he will never admit it, probably even afterward, that he lacked the knowledge.
Have you read his memoir on this?
No, I have not.
I have not either, but I suspect there isn't a chapter called Where I Messed Up, but maybe I'm wrong. It's a little more like Nietzsche's wonderful chapter, Why I'm So Smart, Why I'm So Strong, and that's the modern memoir generally. Let me react to that, because I think, couldn't you argue, and I think this will get us pointed towards your arguments for alternative ways to run government, couldn't you argue that a CEO is a generalist, right? In the old days, if you were, say, an energy company, the CEO of a lot of energy companies is a former engineer, in my small knowledge of this area. Somebody who came up the ranks in the company as an engineer, sometimes as a chemist in other companies, they were a specialist, and they suddenly find themselves in a generalist position. They know a lot about a core competency of the business, the engineering part, but inevitably they know very little about a whole set of stuff that you've already mentioned: personnel, management of people,
finance.
IT, finance. There's 1,000 areas now that a CEO has to deal with.
Yeah.
Now they're flawed. They're just one human being, but they're in competition with other CEOs in other companies, and we rely on that competition as well as the market's response to the scope of the company, as we talked about earlier, to make that work pretty well. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. And in fact, you're, I think, more skeptical than I am of how well that works, and maybe I should be more skeptical. But you suggest in the book that maybe that's a model we ought to move toward in reducing the centralization of power in government, trying to introduce more competition in government to the extent that there is a centralization of power, rely on competition to reduce its likelihood to reward hubris and mistakes.
Okay. Well, so think of the checks and balances that are in place in the market when a CEO thinks that we'll use a he, can do more than he really can. So let's say he buys a company in an industry that he doesn't understand. Well, chances are he's going to mismanage that company, and somewhere along the way, shareholders or investors out there are going to punish him for doing that, or try to snap up that mismanaged company at a low price, manage it better, and make it a better company. So there are these sorts of mechanisms in place, the fight for corporate control, as it's sometimes called, or just shareholder value, that tend to limit they provide a check and a balance on the CEO who thinks they know too much. But imagine a world in which there was no check and balance. If CEO says, I think I'm capable of doing X, he goes out and does it. He says,
and he's a really smart guy.
Yeah, he could be. Yeah, he could be really talented. But he says, I think I can take this energy industry, this energy business, and diversify it into manufacturing or finance. And he just goes ahead, does it with no checks. Where do you think you'd end up with that? You'd probably end up with a lot of really inefficient, large, badly run companies. And that's my model of government, that these people have the ability to just say by fiat, we are capable of doing this. We are capable of regulating drugs. We are capable of regulating urban planning. We are capable of creating an electric car and a grid full of electric cars out of nothing. You get these people being able to do that without any check, without any anyone being able to say no to them, and look where you end up.
But that isn't really the way we regulate many things, right? We have a weird set of checks and balances. I don't think it's a very well designed one. Let's take a couple examples in the regulatory world. Most regulations, this is shocking to me when I first discovered this. I find it's unbelievable, but most regulations are not very specific. The specificity is turned over to the agency, not an expert. It's not the head of the EPA who writes the regulation, or the head of the FDA who writes the regulation, or the head of it's not Barney Frank in the case of financial regulations, and it's not President Obama in the case of healthcare, but a whole raft of individuals who have expertise in the areas that they're involved in. They have a lot of knowledge. They write those regulations, the details, and then it goes through this bizarre process of adjudication through a court system that most of us have no knowledge of, and they fight. People fight over it. There is lots of competition. The industry fights against the activists and the NGOs the non-governmental organizations, the charitable folks, whether they're, it's the wrong word, but the nonprofits, whether they're the Sierra Club or other groups, and there is a process of back and forth, and if they mess up, there's pushback from members of Congress who hear complaints from their constituents. So it's a very Byzantine, highly specialized process of which most of us have no knowledge of. But it's not as autocratic as you make it out to be.
Okay, that's a fair point. That's a fair point. In some ways, I felt more comfortable as you were talking about that, although knowing in the background that typically, who wins in that process is the biggest business with the biggest lawyers.
Yeah.
But you're right. It is a process. It's not. It's not purely autocratic.
I think where it applies more depressingly is the recent crisis, where Bernanke and Paulson did many things with very few checks and balances, and that Congress and to some extent the people acquiesced, though there's quite a bit of anger about it. I find it remarkable how angry people are.
I've said that this election is going to be the first chance that people have to vote against the bailouts. The general interpretation of the election is people are frustrated because of unemployment and the economy and whatever. But I think this is the first chance they've had to vote against the bailouts, and that's what they're looking forward to.
Yeah, I think there's to some extent an overreaction to the change, but I think it's the speed at which it occurred. Involvement of the government in the car industry, the involvement of the government in the financial sector. It's not so much that we're on the road to socialism, because I don't think we are, but it sure looks like a first step or 100 yards down the road.
Certainly an increase in the scope of government, doing things that it didn't do before.
So let's talk about ways that government might exploit some of the improvements in knowledge and information. One of the things you talk about in the book is the role of the internet in changing access to information. Talk about why that's important, and what do you think we could do to take advantage of that?
Yeah, well, there are a number of things that are important, I think, about the internet. One is I think it increases the ability of sort of specialized knowledge to sort of assert itself, because there's nothing stopping anybody from putting up their website or putting up their application. And it's very easy to aggregate information in different ways, from things like Wikipedia, very commonly known sites, to just really unknown niche sites. So there's all sorts of ways, and it's done in a very decentralized way. So a contrast would be with the mass media of the 50s and 60s of radio and television, where it took. If you wanted to communicate using radio or television, you had to pay a huge amount of money to get a license, to get broadcasting equipment, to get, the transmittal tower, the whole bit. So it was just there were only a few people who could send out information over the mass media of the 50s and 60s. Now anybody can. So that's a very different environment, and I think it creates advantages for for decentralized knowledge and for the uses of decentralized knowledge, and it creates fewer advantages for concentration of power. The president can't give a fireside chat and have everyone listen to it and nobody challenge it. That doesn't happen now. When the president speaks, maybe my guess is fewer people actually tune in, and then of those that tune in, a lot of them are critics, and they instantly post their criticism on the internet.
They get their say.
They get their say. So that's a different environment. The other thing that is interesting, I think the internet is an interesting model of a almost anarchy type of situation. The only true central control is the domain registration. I think it's called ICANN, where you if you want to get ArnoldKling.com or russroberts.net or some domain name, you have to go through this one central registry. Beyond that, there's no central control. It's just it's
an ecosystem.
If you join this system and you link up according to the protocols of the system, you're on. And when people need to solve a generic problem on the internet, there are these things called the Internet Engineering Task Forces. At least this was the way it worked 10 years ago, where the task force would assemble to solve a problem. Let's say it was to standardize JavaScript. That was maybe 15 years ago. They set up a task force to standardize JavaScript. And it's just volunteers, people who are interested.
So they set it up, but it kind of set itself up. It kind of just coalesced.
Yeah, I don't know who.
It happens all the time in technical problems now.
So the group of people gets together. We say we need to standardize. So all the people who have a strong interest in it, in how JavaScript works, are on that task force. They meet. They negotiate. They come up with a proposed solution, and they send out the proposed solution. And when people stop complaining about that proposed solution, it stabilizes and it becomes the solution, and the task force disperses. Can you imagine government working like that, where people get together, they're unpaid, and there's volunteers until the problem is solved, and then they disappear? What an amazing system! And if we could have that work in actual government, how much better it would be.
Yeah, I want to ask you about an economics example, a private sector example, before we go to the government. Which kind of introduces, I think, some more nuance into this specialization thing. It's just such a fascinating, to me, just economic phenomenon. So, I want to use Skype, and I have a Mac. So I go download Skype, and I go to connect, and it doesn't connect. It's not working. It tries to sign in, the little ball goes around, then nothing happens. That's weird. So I throw it out. And I try again. I reinstall it. I restart my computer. I do some of the obvious things. Nothing works. Now, one way to solve that problem in 1950, if we had Skype in 1950, would be to call the Skype repair person who would come to my house in his little uniform with the Skype badge, and he'd look at my computer. Oh, you need X, Y, or Z. I don't do that. I get on the web. I Google Skype, Mac, OS, can't sign in. Pull up a bunch of pages from around 2007 where people had a problem like I did. And some of them are on websites where it's called Answer My Problem. and I look at the answers. This is the best answer. I try it. Nothing happens. It doesn't work. On about the seventh try down the Google page count, seventh page of the Google search, I find somebody who says, oh, you need to throw out this folder. I go to my son, who's better at computers than I am. He's 15, and he says, I don't think you should fool around with your library. I don't think you should throw out a library folder. Yeah, he's probably right. And I go down, I scroll down some more, and someone said, yeah, I tried that thing about throwing out that folder. That didn't work, but it helped me because I realized I got to throw out this even bigger subset of folders. So I tried that, and it worked. I solved the problem myself. I'm not a specialist. I'm becoming a generalist. I'm good at Skype repair. Yeah. But the internet, right, allows that kind of problem solving in a way that is just draws on. It aggregates knowledge in an incredible way.
Yeah. Now, Clay Shirky talks a lot about
Correct.
that phenomenon.
Yeah, absolutely.
People, people who used to maybe spend their time watching television can now spend their time creating public goods like answers to problems like how to fix Skype.
Also, by the way, helped me unclog my bathtub without having to call a plumber. Again, instead of calling on the specialist and using the plumber, I was able to figure out a solution. Again, it took a while. It took me maybe half an hour of Googling around. A lot of the solutions that were proposed didn't help me. Eventually, if you send me a private envelope with a self-addressed stamped envelope and a $20 bill, I'll tell you how that worked out. No, I'm just kidding. But let's go back to government then. You talked about a task force that could disband. Could we imagine some problems that government currently solves through command and control, that it maybe could be solved in different ways. And I want to start by mentioning, I've heard you talk about it. It's not in the book, but it's just such an important point. A lot of times, government's justified on the basis of some kind of information asymmetry. Oh, it's imperfect knowledge. We've got to solve this problem this way. And some people say, for example, the financial crisis is caused by deregulation. And you've pointed out very incredibly clearly, it's such an obvious point, well, then the solution is just to re-regulate. And yet that's not what we did. There's an enormous disconnect for political reasons often between the problems the government is allegedly solving and the solutions that are proposed.
Yeah, just for the record, folks, I didn't say that that I believe the solution is to re-regulate. I said if you think that what happened is we deregulated, well, find those regulations and stick them back on.
That's not happening. So can we think of some examples where, even though the government solution now isn't very well tailored perhaps to the problem, but where there would be a solution that's tailored to the problem that could be more decentralized?
Well, let's suppose government got out of the meat inspection business. Now, people, I think, are pretty aware.
Egg inspection be another one.
Okay, got out of the egg inspection business. We've just gone through a period where eggs had salmonella. Suppose government got out of that business. Well, people are kind of aware that just buying eggs at random could be dangerous. So what do we think would happen? My guess is that the egg manufacturers would have a really strong interest in being able to sell certified eggs. And so they would look to somebody to create an egg inspection service. And that egg inspection service would have to find some way to establish that it's credible. And it would want to establish and maintain its credibility.
Like Consumer Reports.
It might even have more of an incentive to maintain its credibility than the government egg inspection agency. Because my guess is hardly, the government egg if a private egg inspection agency had messed up like this, they'd be out of business, right? No one would trust them anymore. The CEO would have lost their job. The people would have all be fired. I mean, it would disappear. But the government, I don't even know if anyone got fired over this. Maybe, but perhaps nobody. There's no systemic check on that. So that's an example where you could see a private thing emerging.
And yet, you point out in the book that the ratings agencies, which many people believe failed in their monitoring of the financial crisis, they're still in existence. And I think there's a reason for that, but I'm going to let you give yours. Why did they go out of business? Why did Moody's and Fitch and Standard & Poor's, why do they still exist?
Part of the problem is that where they messed up was in rating securities that were not going to be traded in the marketplace. The whole purpose of the ratings was to get lower capital requirements from the regulators. So the customer indirectly was the regulator. When Moody's rates a bond, they rate it on behalf of the seller of the bond, the corporation that's selling the bond, but there's a customer out there, in some sense, the buyer of the bond. And if Moody's betrays that customer, at some point, those customers will stop using those ratings, and so General Motors will stop going to Moody's to get the bonds rated. But when the customer was the regulators didn't care. The regulators didn't fire Moody's. In fact, I think at one point somebody introduced an amendment to the financial reform bill saying that regulators could not use ratings. And I was excited. I thought, wow, somebody introduced that. And I thought it even passed at one point. But then I found out that in the final,
markup,
finally, when it finally was negotiated between the House and Senate, that was no longer there. But I think that if the rating agencies were to mess up in rating bonds that are actually traded as badly as they messed up in rating bonds that were just being rated to while they were sitting on the bank's books and rated in order to get past the regulators. So if they'd actually made that mistake regulating private bonds, and if they were not supported by the government, in fact, creating this oligopoly, then I think some of them would go out of business. I think
it's actually worse than that, because I think they're required by law. I think GM is required by law when they issue a bond to have it be rated. And as a result, I think that is what props up those folks.
That and the combination that the license to be a rating agency is in effect issued by the SEC. They say you must use one of these agencies, and it's a small group of agencies. It's like
it's three.
Yeah, and it's sort of like the accounting business, where there's the big four accounting firms now. With so much pressure on big companies to have proper accounting, there's this sense that if one more accounting firm goes out of business, we won't have a functioning accounting thing. So they're protected from going out of business now in the same way that the rating agencies were protected from going.
But
out
in
of
case
business.
of the rating agencies, there was something happened 2 months ago that was very, I think, almost ignored. It was a rather remarkable event. In the new financial reform, shouldn't call it that. That gives it a certain, it's called the new set of financial regulations. There were penalties on the ratings agencies for, quote, making a mistake. And I'm not sure how that's actually enforced, right? Obviously, you can give something a AAA rating and it goes bankrupt. That can happen. Ex ante, you can misassess for perfectly good reasons. If you systematically misassessed, as they appear to have done, then you could argue they failed. So in the new regulations, there's a stark penalty. I don't remember what it is, but they're on the hook or have either in fines or legal for quote, bad ratings. So they immediately said, when Ford was going to issue a bond, they said, well, we're not going to rate this because it's too scary. It's a bad time. And the government waived the requirement that the Ford bond have a rating. And of course, people bought it without the rating. Yeah. But to me, that illustrated this is a weird, very not real, normal, competitive market. We're almost out of time. Let me ask you the following. You have a lot of creative ideas in the book for the use of vouchers, other ways to introduce more competition to the government. Most of those, not all of them, but most of them would be considered unviable politically. Okay, there's two strategies we could follow. Those of us who'd like to see more competition and fewer and less power in government. We could push for those ideas, even though they're, quote, considered politically non-viable, and maybe over the next 10, 20, or 30 years, they'll be seen as more attractive because people understand maybe some of these forces. The other is to be more activist, to look for sort of brute force ways to restrain the power of government, term limits. People proposed a bunch of stuff. Do you have any thoughts on what might work, what might be some source of optimism that government might actually get smaller down the road?
I think we have a ways to go in terms of changing the culture and mindset of both elites and masses. I think for masses, I think it's a case, for ordinary people, I think it's a case of opening their eyes to possibilities. Like I talk about virtual government, a notion that you could sign up and say, I belong to this government for the purpose of, let's say, welfare programs or education. And it could be that this government is run out of California, even though you live in New Jersey. That is, I belong to a California education system, even though I live in New Jersey. Or, so that... You
gave an example. Your garbage collection could be run by it could be public still. We don't have to necessarily privatize it, but if you wanted public, why have it be only related to your physical jurisdiction?
Yeah. Now, garbage collection makes some sense to have a physical jurisdiction, but look at lawn care. We don't, it makes as much sense to have the same guy mow everybody's lawn in my neighborhood as it does to have the same guy pick up all the garbage or
teach our children.
But yet we managed to get an emergent order with different lawn care people operating. So so we could disaggregate government in some way, but it's getting people to think in those terms. That's the first thing. I think for the elites, I think it's just a case of gradually losing some of the illusions they have. And the example that I can think of is in the 1970s, where the elites thought that wage and price controls would be a solution to inflation and unemployment. It would just be a great thing. And they, throughout the 60s, they kept saying, try it, try it, try it. We finally tried it in the 70s. The results were horrible. And no one advocates wage and price controls as a solution today. And I think that it's just a matter, the ability of the human mind to tune out negative feedback is tremendous. Confirmation bias is great, but maybe at some point elites will start to see that concentration of power doesn't work as well as they've been expecting it to.
My guest today has been Arnold Kling. Arnold, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
All right. You're welcome.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.